The city was alive with the sound of car horns and distant chatter, the streets illuminated by the golden glow of streetlights. In the heart of this bustling metropolis stood Sandy Breeze Resort, an upscale restaurant known for its exquisite cuisine and exclusive clientele. The large glass windows revealed a world of elegance inside, glittering chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, and well-dressed patrons indulging in gourmet meals. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully between tables, carrying silver trays adorned with delicacies. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly baked bread, seared steak, and the faint hint of expensive perfume. Outside, standing near the entrance, was James Carter. His unkempt beard, ragged clothes, and tired eyes made him stand out in stark contrast to the refined guests inside. He had once walked these streets as a different man, but now life had pushed him to its cruelest edge. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, he gazed at the restaurant's bright lights, his stomach twisting with hunger. The memories of warm meals and soft beds felt like a distant dream. He took a deep breath, gathering the courage to step inside. As soon as James entered, the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations filled the air. He felt the stares before he even saw them, eyes filled with disdain and judgment. The laughter that had once been merry suddenly died down, replaced by whispers and disapproving glances. The luxurious interior, so inviting to others, now felt suffocating to him. Standing near the entrance was Michael Reed, the restaurant's head waiter. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with an air of superiority, Michael immediately noticed James. His sharp blue eyes narrowed as he approached with a forced professional smile, masking his disgust. "Sir, I believe you might be lost," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. James hesitated. I was wondering if I could get something to eat," he said, his voice hoarse from days of hunger. He wasn't asking for charity, just a chance to sit down, to feel human for a moment. Michael's smile disappeared. A few guests chuckled under their breath, entertained by the spectacle. "I'm afraid we have a dress code here," Michael sneered, looking James up and down. "And let's be honest, this is not the kind of place for people like you." His words cut deep, laced with cruelty. In the corner of the room, a young waitress named Sophia Lane watched the scene unfold. Unlike the others, she didn't see a homeless man. She saw a human being, tired and hungry, her heart clenched at the sight of James's sunken cheeks and trembling hands. Before she could step in, Michael turned to her, his expression hard. "Sophia, don't waste your time. He's leaving," he said, making it clear that kindness had no place here. James felt the heat of shame creeping up his face, his fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in helplessness. The laughter of the guests, the smug look on Michael's face, it was all too much. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Without another word, he turned around and walked out, the sound of his worn-out shoes scraping against the polished floor. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, a stark contrast to the warmth he had just left. The streets, once filled with promise, now felt like an endless road of struggle. He looked back at the restaurant, his reflection barely visible in the pristine glass doors. He had come hoping for a small act of kindness, but he had only found cruelty. Little did they know, this was not the last time James Carter would step into Sandy Breeze Resort. Tomorrow, everything would change. James Carter took slow, hesitant steps toward the restaurant's main counter, where the host's podium stood like a silent gatekeeper to a world he no longer belonged to. The chandeliers above reflected off the polished marble floor, making it shine like a mirror. Every elegant detail of Sandy Breeze Resort reminded him of what he once had and what he had lost. He wasn't here to beg, he just wanted something warm to eat. He had no money, but maybe, just maybe, someone would show him an ounce of kindness. The moment he crossed the threshold, heads turned. Conversations paused, and subtle gasps filled the air. Women clutched their handbags tighter. Men threw disgusted glances his way. The air grew heavy with judgment, and James could feel it pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He had spent years surviving on the streets, but this was different. He was being stripped of his dignity right in front of them. Michael Reed, the head waiter, noticed the disturbance and swiftly made his way over. His tailored uniform hugged his frame perfectly, his neatly styled hair and pristine gloves adding to his air of arrogance. He had worked at Sandy Breeze Resort for years, and he took pride in keeping it exclusive. To him, James wasn't just an unwelcome guest, he was an infestation. Michael stepped in front of James, blocking his way. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he had no intention of offering help. His eyes flickered over James's tattered clothes and unshaven face, his lip curling in disdain. James swallowed, ignoring the burning humiliation creeping up his spine. "I was wondering if I could get something to eat," he said, his voice raspy from hunger. He didn't expect a feast, just something to keep his stomach from aching through the night. Michael chuckled, loud enough for the guests near the entrance to hear. A few diners smirked, watching the exchange like it was a form of entertainment. "Sir, this is a 5-star restaurant," Michael said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We don't exactly hand out free meals." He glanced over his shoulder at a few guests who were now whispering and giggling behind their wine glasses. James's fingers curled into his palm. He wasn't angry. He was exhausted. He had spent years being ignored, but tonight he wasn't just invisible. He was the punchline of a cruel joke. "I don't want charity," James replied, his voice firm but weary. "I just thought you thought wrong." Michael cut him off, taking a step closer. "You don't belong here." James flinched at the words. They stung, not because they were untrue, but because they confirmed what he already feared. He was no longer welcome in the world he once thrived in. A soft voice broke through the tension. "Michael, maybe we could just—" Michael turned sharply. "Sophia, stay out of this," he snapped. The young waitress, Sophia Lane, had been watching from a distance, her heart aching for the man standing before them. She had seen James before, wandering near the restaurant, always keeping to himself. He never begged, never caused trouble. He was just lost. Sophia met James's eyes, and in them she saw something the others didn't. Dignity buried beneath hardship. But before she could say anything else, Michael grabbed James by the arm, his grip firm and dismissive. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Michael said, dragging James toward the door. His voice was loud enough to ensure everyone in the restaurant heard. The murmurs turned into chuckles. A few guests whispered, shaking their heads in amusement. James didn't resist. He let Michael push him out, his body swaying slightly from weakness. The doors shut behind him with a final resounding click, sealing him out as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. The laughter inside faded, replaced by the muffled sounds of forks clinking against plates. James stood still for a moment, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass doors. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, clothes that barely kept him warm. He had once worn tailored suits, once dined at places like this without a second thought. But now he was nothing to them, nothing but a ghost of the past. The cold wind wrapped around him like an unwelcome embrace. He pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame and took slow steps away from the restaurant. His stomach growled in protest, but he had long since learned to ignore it. The streets had become his home, the night his only companion. A group of teenagers passed by, their laughter echoing through the empty streets. One of them, a boy no older than 16, sneered as he spotted James. "Hey, old man, looking for food in the trash?" he called out, tossing a crumpled burger wrapper in James's direction. His friends erupted in laughter before disappearing. Around the corner, James didn't react. He simply sighed, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. He had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. Back inside the restaurant, Michael straightened his tie, feeling satisfied with himself. He turned back to the guests with a practiced smile. "Apologies for the disruption," he said smoothly. "Shall we continue?" The laughter resumed, the moment forgotten as quickly as it had begun. Plates were refilled, glasses clinked, and Sandy Breeze Resort returned to its world of luxury, unbothered by the man it had just thrown away. Sophia, however, couldn't forget. She peeked through the glass, watching James as he disappeared down the street. Guilt weighed heavy in her chest. She wanted to run after him, offer him something, anything, but she knew Michael would fire her in an instant. James walked until his legs ached, until the bright lights of the city blurred into distant flickers. He found a small, empty alley and slumped against the cold brick wall. He pulled his coat tighter, but it did little to fight off the chill. He was so tired, so hungry. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back, breathing out a shaky sigh. "Come, back when you can afford it," Michael's voice echoed in his mind. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. If only they knew who he was. If only they knew what he had been. James had spent years being unseen. But tomorrow they would see him. Tomorrow everything would change. James Carter sat on the cold pavement, his back pressed against the rough brick wall of an alleyway. The night was merciless, the wind slicing through his tattered coat like a blade. His fingers, stiff and numb, curled into his lap as he fought against the hunger gnawing at his insides. He tilted his head back, staring at the dark sky above, searching for answers in the stars that blinked faintly through the city's artificial glow. His mind drifted back to a time when nights like these were spent in warmth, when he had a home, a family, a future. He wasn't always like this. There was a time when he had everything a man could ask for. James had once been a successful entrepreneur. He had built his own marketing firm from the ground up, working tirelessly to turn his ideas into reality. At 35, he was at the top of his game, respected in the industry and admired by his peers. Money was never a problem. His suits were custom-made, his watch cost more than most people made in a month, and dining at expensive restaurants like Sandy Breeze Resort had been an afterthought, not a privilege. But success, he had learned the hard way, could be fragile. It could shatter in an instant. It started with a bad investment, one risky decision that snowballed into financial ruin. He had trusted the wrong business partner, a man who drained their company accounts and disappeared overnight, leaving James to pick up the pieces. Lawsuits followed, creditors circled like vultures, and the empire he had built with his own two hands crumbled before his eyes. Still, James could have rebuilt it. He had the mind, the skill, the determination. But tragedy struck when he least expected it. His wife, Emma, had been his rock. She had stood by him through every success and every failure, reminding him that money was never the most important thing. They had dreamed of growing old together, of traveling the world once things settled down. But those dreams never came to pass. The day he lost everything was the day Emma fell sick. The diagnosis came out of nowhere, stage 4 cancer. He had spent every last dime trying to save her, selling what little he had left to afford treatments that never worked. Watching the love of his life wither away in a hospital bed had been far more painful than losing any amount of money. And then, just like that, she was gone. James had never recovered. After Emma's death, the weight of his losses became unbearable. He had no business, no money, no home. He had sold his car, his belongings, anything that could have kept him afloat. But the world didn't care. It kept moving forward, leaving him behind like yesterday's news. At first he tried to fight. He applied for jobs, knocked on doors, begged old colleagues for a chance. But people only saw a man who had failed, a shadow of the powerful businessman he once was. They avoided him, refused to take his calls, dismissed him as if he were already gone. Pride had kept him from asking for help. At some point, he simply gave up. The streets became his reality, the city his prison. Each day was about survival, finding enough food to last the night, searching for a safe place to sleep, avoiding the cold that seeped into his bones. And now, here he was, a nobody, A forgotten man. James exhaled, his breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The memory of Michael's sneering face replayed in his mind. Come back when you can afford it. He clenched his jaw, not out of anger, but out of something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. Somewhere deep inside him, a fire reignited. The world had taken everything from him, but it hadn't taken his will to fight. He wasn't dead yet, and tomorrow he would prove it. Tomorrow everything would change. The night deepened, and the streets of the city became quieter. James sat on the cold pavement, pulling his coat tighter around himself. The hunger in his stomach had become a dull ache, something he had learned to ignore. His mind kept drifting, back to Michael's words, to the laughter of the diners at Sandy Breeze Resort. He had been humiliated, but more than that, he had been reminded of what he had lost. As he sat there, staring at the empty street, the quiet hum of an approaching car broke the silence. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop just a few feet away. From him, James barely paid attention. Fancy cars were common in this part of town. But then the back window rolled down. A deep, authoritative voice called out, "You look like a man who's seen better days." James turned his head, squinting, against the bright headlights. Inside the car sat an elderly man in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, filled with wisdom and curiosity. James hesitated before responding. "You could say that," the old man smiled. "What's your name?" "James." "Well, James," the man said, resting, his arm on the car door, "I'm Mr. Anderson, and something tells me you're not where you're supposed to be." James let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah? And where am I supposed to be?" Mr. Anderson studied him for a long moment. "Not here. Not on the streets." His voice was calm, but firm, as if he already knew James's story without him having to say a word. James sighed and looked away. "Life doesn't always go the way you plan." Mr. Anderson nodded. "That's true, but sometimes all it takes is one right move to change everything." He leaned slightly forward. "Tell me, James, if you had a second chance, what would you do with it?" James frowned, caught off guard by the question. He had spent so long just trying to survive that he hadn't allowed himself to dream beyond tomorrow. "I don't know," he admitted. "I used to be someone, had a business, a life. But that's gone now." Mr. Anderson didn't seem surprised. "And if you had the opportunity to rebuild," James scoffed, shaking his head. "That's not how the world works." Mr. Anderson smirked. "No, it's not. But sometimes the world makes exceptions for the right people." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black envelope. He extended it toward James. "Take this." James hesitated before accepting it. He looked at the envelope in his hands, confused. "What is this?" "A key," Mr. Anderson said simply. "A key to an opportunity. If you want it, meet me tomorrow morning at the Grand Royal Hotel, 7 o'clock sharp. Come as you are." James looked up. "Why would you help me?" Mr. Anderson's eyes twinkled with something unreadable. "Because I've been where you are, and I know what it's like to have the world turn its back on you." Before James could say another word, Mr. Anderson rolled up the window. The sedan pulled away, disappearing into the night. James sat there, staring at the envelope in his hands. It felt heavy, not in weight but in meaning. For the first time in a long time, something stirred in his chest. Hope. Tomorrow everything would change. James Carter barely slept that night. The black envelope sat in his hands, his fingers tracing its edges over and over again, as if trying to confirm it was real. Was this some kind of trick? A cruel joke? Or was it truly the opportunity he had been waiting for? The words of Mr. Anderson echoed in his mind. "If you had a second chance, what would you do with it?" Morning came faster than expected. The first golden rays of sunlight spilled onto the city streets, casting long shadows as the world slowly came to life. James hadn't felt this nervous in years. He took a deep breath and made his way toward the Grand Royal Hotel, his heartbeat steady but fast. He didn't have anything to change into, no way to make himself look presentable. But Mr. Anderson had said, "Come as you are." As he stepped into the towering lobby of the Grand Royal, he immediately felt out of place. The polished marble floors, the gold-trimmed chandeliers, the scent of fresh flowers, it all reminded him of the life he once lived. The hotel staff stole quick glances at him, but no one dared to say anything. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe they were just used to seeing strange requests from the wealthy guests who walked through these doors. At exactly 7 o'clock, the elevator doors opened, and Mr. Anderson stepped out. He was dressed just as impeccably as the night before, but there was something different about him in the daylight. He wasn't just a well-dressed old man. He exuded power, influence. He smiled when he saw James. "You came," James nodded. "Not sure why yet." Mr. Anderson gestured for him to follow. "You will be." They entered an elegant private suite, where breakfast had been set up. Freshly brewed coffee, golden. Croissants and eggs cooked to perfection. The smell made James's stomach twist. It had been too long since he had eaten a real meal. "Sit," Mr. Anderson said, motioning toward the table. James hesitated before lowering himself into the plush chair. The moment he did, a hotel staff member poured him a cup of coffee, then stepped back without a word. James wrapped his hands around the warm cup, savoring the simple pleasure. Mr. Anderson watched him with amusement. "Eat, James. You'll need your strength." James didn't argue. He ate in silence, aware that Mr. Anderson was observing him. Once he finished, the older man leaned back and crossed his arms. "Now let's talk business." James wiped his mouth with a napkin, sitting up straight. "Business?" Mr. Anderson nodded. "I told you last night that I know what it's like to have the world turn its back on you. What I didn't tell you is that I rebuilt myself from nothing. I lost everything once, more than once, actually, and each time I clawed my way back up." He leaned in. "And I see that same fire in you." James frowned. "I don't even know where to start." "You don't have to," Mr. Anderson said. "I do." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a document. He slid it across the table. James hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the page and his heart nearly stopped. It was a business contract. A legitimate investment offer. James looked up in shock. What? What is this?" Mr. Anderson smirked. "I'm giving you a chance, James. A real one. A financial backing to start again, but I need to know if you're willing to fight for it." James's hands trembled slightly as he held the papers. "Why me? You could give this to anyone." Mr. Anderson's expression turned serious. "Because I see something in you that most people don't, and because I believe that people deserve a second chance if they're willing to take it." James took a deep breath. This was it. A lifeline. A way out. "I'm in," he said. Mr. Anderson grinned. "Good. Then let's get started." Tomorrow everything would change. The next evening, the golden lights of Sandy Breeze Resort flickered like stars, illuminating the polished glass doors and elegant outdoor seating. Inside, waiters bustled about, ensuring everything was perfect. The aroma of sizzling steaks, fresh seafood, and warm bread filled the air. It was another busy night, filled with the city's elite, business moguls, celebrities, and high profile. Guests. Among them was Michael Reed, the arrogant head waiter who moved through the restaurant with his usual air of superiority. Everything was just as it had been the night before. Everything except for one small detail. Outside, a long black limousine rolled up to the restaurant's entrance. The valet staff, who had grown accustomed to handling luxury vehicles, straightened their jackets as they prepared to greet yet another wealthy guest. The car's engine hummed softly before the door opened, and a polished leather shoe stepped onto the pavement. James Carter emerged from the limousine. But this was not the James who had been mocked and thrown out just a night ago. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair styled, and his suit, perfectly tailored midnight black with silver cufflinks, spoke of nothing but wealth and class. A sleek watch adorned his wrist, and confidence radiated from his very presence. He walked with purpose, his posture commanding attention. The valet greeted him with a respectful nod. "Good evening, sir." James returned the nod, slipping the man a generous tip. Evening. As he approached the entrance, the restaurant staff scrambled to open the doors for him. The moment he stepped inside, heads turned. The low hum of conversations dwindled into whispers. Guests instinctively straightened up in their seats, recognizing that this man, whoever he was, held a certain power. Michael, who had been taking an order at a nearby table, caught sight of the new arrival. At first, he didn't recognize James. How could he? The transformation was nothing short of remarkable, but then, as James locked eyes with him, something inside Michael twisted uncomfortably. A flicker of familiarity, a creeping sense of unease. James walked straight to the front podium, where Michael stood frozen. The waiter quickly composed himself, forcing his usual fake smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Sandy Breeze Resort. Do you have a reservation?" James let a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "I believe you told me yesterday that I should come back when I could afford it." Michael's face drained of color. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. It was then that he realized this was the same man he had thrown out the night before. But how? How could a homeless man return less than 24 hours later, dressed in wealth and exuding power? Michael fumbled for words. I didn't mean." James held up a hand, silencing him. He turned to the restaurant manager, who had now hurried over, sensing the tension. The manager, a balding man with round glasses, immediately recognized that this was not someone to be treated lightly. "Sir, my deepest apologies if you were mistreated in any way," the manager said smoothly, trying to control the damage before it escalated. "Please, allow us to offer you the finest seat in the house." James glanced at Michael, whose confidence had crumbled. "That won't be necessary," he said coolly. "I'll take a regular table." Sophia, the kind-hearted waitress from Asia the night before, had been watching the scene from a distance. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening. She stepped forward. "I'll take his order," she said quickly, before Michael could interfere. James smiled warmly at her. "Thank you, Sophia." Michael, now completely humiliated, took a step back. He watched in silent fury as James was led to a comfortable booth near the center of the restaurant. Guests continued to whisper, trying to piece together the mystery of who this man was. As James settled into his seat, Sophia placed a menu in front of him. "What can I get you tonight, sir?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. James chuckled. "No, sir," needed Sophia. He glanced over the menu briefly before setting it down. "I'll have whatever you recommend." Sophia smiled, relief flooding through her. "Coming right up." Meanwhile, Michael lingered near the entrance, still shaken. His mind raced for answers. He had always believed that wealth and power were permanent, that once a man fell, he stayed down. But James had shattered that belief in an instant. James caught his stare and leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Funny how quickly things change, isn't it, Michael?" he mused. Michael flinched. He wanted to speak, to explain, to save face in some way. But there was nothing to say. James gestured for him to come closer. Reluctantly, Michael obeyed. "Tell me," James said, tilting his head slightly. "What do you see when you look at me now?" Michael's mouth went dry. I see a man of success," James chuckled. "And last night," Michael had no answer. James let the silence stretch before finally speaking again. "You judged me based on my appearance, not my worth. And you're not the only one. That's how the world works, doesn't it?" He leaned forward slightly. "But here's the thing, Michael. Power isn't just about money. It's about respect. And you have none." Michael swallowed hard, his face burning with shame. James exhaled, shaking his head. "I could have you fired tonight. One word, and your job is gone." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "But I won't." Michael blinked in surprise. "You won't?" "No," James said, standing up and adjusting his suit. "Because you'll fire yourself when you realize that no one respects a man who treats others like dirt." He slipped a generous tip onto the table for Sophia and buttoned his jacket. "Good luck, Michael." With that, James turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Michael standing in stunned silence. As he stepped outside, the valet rushed forward to open the limousine door. James paused, looking back at the restaurant one last time. The same place that had thrown him out in disgrace was now filled with people whispering his name, wondering who he was, wondering how he had turned his fate around in a single day. A smile tugged at his lips as he stepped into the limousine, because he knew the truth. Life could change in an instant, and for James Carter, this was just the beginning. As the limousine pulled away from Sandy Breeze Resort, James Carter leaned back against the leather seats, watching the city lights blur past. The confrontation with Michael had been satisfying, but that wasn't what mattered most. He hadn't returned for revenge. He had returned to prove a point, to himself, to Michael, and to everyone who had written him off. The car slowed at a red light, and James let out a deep breath. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind, but the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He had spent years believing he was finished, that life had nothing more to offer him. But fate had other plans. James tapped the divider glass, signaling the driver to take a detour. He had one more stop to make before the night was over. Meanwhile, back at Sandy Breeze Resort, Michael Reed was still reeling from what had just happened. He stood motionless at the entrance, his jaw tight, his palms sweaty. Never in his life had he felt so humiliated. He had spent years looking down on people like James, believing that wealth and status determined a person's worth. And yet, in a single night, the very man he had mocked had turned the tables on him. His colleagues whispered behind his back. Even some guests were sneaking glances, murmuring about how the arrogant headwaiter had just been put in his place. The shame burned in his chest. Sophia, on the other hand, felt something entirely different. Hope. She had seen James at his lowest, and now she had seen him rise. It was a reminder that life could change in an instant. Michael turned on his heel and stormed toward the back of the restaurant, slamming open the staff entrance. He needed air. He needed to think. He had spent his entire career believing he was better than others, that his uniform and title gave him power, but tonight had shattered that illusion. For the first time, he felt small. James's limousine arrived at a small diner on the quieter side of the city. It wasn't glamorous, but the warm glow of the lights and the smell of home-cooked food gave it an undeniable charm. This was the kind of place where no one cared who you were as long as you were kind. As James stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled softly. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, smiled at him. "Welcome in, dear. Have a seat anywhere you like." James nodded and took a seat at the counter. He looked around, families enjoying meals, an elderly man sipping coffee, a young couple sharing a plate of fries. No one here was concerned with status or wealth. They were just people. The waitress poured him a cup of coffee. "Rough night?" she asked. James chuckled. "You could say that." She gave him a knowing look. "Well, whatever it is, a warm meal helps." James smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash, more than enough to buy dinner for everyone in the diner. He set it on the counter. "Tonight, everyone eats for free." The waitress's eyes widened. "Oh, sweetheart, that's—" James held up a hand. "No questions, just a good meal for good people." A murmur spread through the diner as people realized what had just happened. Strangers smiled at him, nodding in thanks. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Is he a king?" James laughed softly. "Not a king, just a man who knows what it's like to be hungry." The waitress placed a hot plate of food in front of him. A simple meal, but to James it tasted better than any five-star dish. As he ate, he thought about Michael, about how, in some ways, they weren't so different. Michael had power in his small world, and he had used it to belittle others. James had once done the same in his own way. Back when he had been rich, he hadn't always noticed people like Sophia or the kind waitress serving him now. It took losing everything for him to truly see. As he finished his meal, James made a decision. Tomorrow, he would return to Sandy Breeze Resort, But not as a guest. He had one more lesson to teach. The following evening, Sandy Breeze Resort was once again buzzing with activity. The elegant dining hall was filled with well-dressed guests, the air thick with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of background music. Everything appeared as it always had, exclusive, refined, and unwelcoming to those who didn't fit the image. But tonight, something was different. A black limousine pulled up outside, just as it had the night before. The valet staff straightened their jackets, expecting yet another high-profile guest. The chauffeur stepped out, walked to the back, and opened the door. James Carter stepped out, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Mr. Anderson, the same man who had extended him a second chance just the night before. With his silver hair neatly combed back and a presence that commanded respect, he looked every bit the business mogul he was. But what truly turned heads was the group of people behind them, men and women, dressed in a mix of formal and casual attire, each one carefully chosen. James had spent the entire day planning this moment. He hadn't just come back for a meal. He had come back to change something. As they stepped inside, the reaction was immediate. Conversation slowed, eyes turned, and the staff scrambled to respond. Michael Reed, who had barely recovered from the previous night's humiliation, was at the podium once again. His face paled when he saw James walk in, now accompanied by a powerful figure like Mr. Anderson. Good evening, sir," Michael stammered, forcing a tight smile. "Welcome back to Sandy Breeze Resort." James studied him for a moment before speaking. "I believe you remember me, Michael." Michael swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Carter." The use of his last name was a sudden shift. Last night he was a beggar. Tonight he was Mr. Carter. It was amusing how quickly respect followed wealth. James turned to Mr. Anderson, who looked at the restaurant with mild curiosity. "Well?" James asked. "What do you think?" Mr. Anderson gave a slow nod. "It's a fine establishment, I suppose." He turned to Michael, his sharp eyes narrowing. "But from what I've heard, the service leaves much to be desired." Michael tensed. The weight of the billionaire's words pressed against him like a suffocating force. I assure you, sir, we provide the best service in town." James smirked. "Do you? Because just last night I was thrown out of here like garbage." A murmur spread through the restaurant. Some guests who had been present the night before turned away, embarrassed to have witnessed it. Others leaned in, eager to see where this was going. Michael opened his mouth to defend himself, but Mr. Anderson raised a hand, silencing him. "Do you know who you insulted, Mr. Reed?" His voice was calm, but his presence was suffocating. "James Carter isn't just a man with money. He's my new business partner." The color drained from Michael's face. Business partner?" James pulled out a sleek folder from inside his suit and handed it to the restaurant manager, who had hurried over upon hearing the commotion. "As of this morning, Sandy Breeze Resort is under new management." Gasps filled the air. Michael looked like he had been struck by lightning. The manager's hands shook as he flipped through the documents, confirming what James had just said. This is a formal buyout agreement." His voice wavered. "Mr. Carter, are you saying that you—" James nodded. "I now own this restaurant." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Michael looked like he might collapse. James turned to face him directly. "Do you remember what you told me, Michael?" he asked, his voice calm. "You said, 'Come back when you can afford it.' Well," he gestured around, "I'm back, and I more than afford it." Michael stammered. "Mr. Carter, James didn't let him finish. "You judged me based on my appearance. You treated me as if I were less than human because I didn't fit your definition of wealth and status. And now you're standing in front of me, realizing that you had no idea who I really was." Michael's hands trembled. "Please, sir, I didn't mean—" James sighed. "I could fire you right now. I could humiliate you in front of everyone, just like you did to me." He let the words hang in the air. Michael visibly shrank under the weight of them. Then, to everyone's surprise, James didn't fire him. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "But I'm not going to." Michael's eyes widened. James stepped closer. "Because I'm going to give you something you never gave me." He let the words sink in. A second chance. The restaurant was silent. Even the guests seemed frozen in their seats. Not saying you deserve it, James continued, but I know what it's like to fall. I know what it's like to be at the bottom, hoping someone will just see you as a person instead of a failure. His gaze hardened, and I hope this moment teaches you that no one stays on top forever. Respect isn't about how much money you have. It's about how you treat people, especially when you think they have nothing to offer you. Michael's throat bobbed. He didn't know what to say. James took one last look around before addressing the entire restaurant. Under my ownership, Sandy Breeze Resort will be a place where people are treated with dignity. We'll still serve the finest food, but we will also serve with kindness. Because at the end of the day, wealth comes and goes. But how you treat people, that's what truly matters. Applause erupted from the guests, and Sophia wiped a tear from her eye as she clapped the loudest. Michael looked down, nodding shakily. I understand. James turned to the manager. Make sure everyone knows the change is coming. And as for Michael, he glanced at the now humbled man. His future here depends on whether he learns from this. Michael nodded quickly. I will. I swear I will. James exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in years. He had walked into Sandy Breeze Resort as a beggar. He had returned as a lesson. And now he was its owner. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, everything would change. As the applause slowly faded, James Carter took one last glance around the restaurant. Sandy Breeze Resort, a place that once turned him away with nothing but cruelty, was now his. Not just in name, but in purpose. It was no longer a symbol of exclusivity and arrogance. It was going to be a place of dignity and respect, a place where no one would be treated as less than because of their appearance. He turned back to Sophia, who was still standing near. His table, her eyes glistening with emotion. Out of everyone in this restaurant, she was the only one who had seen him as a person, not just a homeless man. He smiled warmly at her. You're a good person, Sophia, he said, his voice softer. Now, I need more people like you to help me run this place. Sophia's eyes widened. Are you offering me a promotion? James chuckled. I'm offering you a management position, she gasped. Me? You saw me when no one else did, James said. That's the kind of person I want in charge. Someone who understands that kindness doesn't cost a thing. Tears welled up in her eyes as she covered her mouth. I don't know what to say. Say yes, James said simply. Sophia wiped her tears away and nodded. Yes, absolutely yes. The guests clapped again, this time with genuine admiration. They had come expecting an ordinary dinner, but they had witnessed something far greater, a man reclaiming his worth and lifting others up along the way. James turned back to Michael, who had remained silent, standing near the entrance with his head slightly bowed. The arrogant, condescending man from the night before was gone. In his place was someone who looked genuinely ashamed. James sighed, walking toward him. Michael slowly looked up. Yes, sir? James studied him for a long moment before speaking. You have a choice. Michael straightened. You can walk out that door and pretend this night never happened, James continued. Or you can stay, learn from your mistakes, and prove that you deserve a second chance. Michael's throat bobbed. He had expected to be fired. In fact, he had deserved to be fired. But James was doing something he had never expected. He was giving him a chance to change. Michael nodded slowly. I'd like to stay. His voice was quieter than usual, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. James nodded back. Then prove it. Michael swallowed and bowed his head slightly. I will. For the first time since their encounter, James believed him. Later that night, as the restaurant emptied and the last of the staff cleaned up, James walked through the grand dining hall, taking it all in. He had been here before, but under very different circumstances. He had entered as a man who had lost everything, and he had left humiliated. But tonight he walked through these doors as a man who had won back his dignity. Mr. Anderson, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped beside him. You handled that well, he said, his voice laced with approval. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I hope so. Anderson smirked. You didn't just buy a restaurant tonight, James. You changed something. And trust me, not many people get the chance to do that. James nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He had been given a second chance, and now he was giving it to others. He looked out the restaurant window where the city glowed under the night sky. The same streets where he had once wandered, lost and forgotten, now looked different. They no longer seemed like an endless road of struggle. They looked like a new beginning. James smiled to himself. Tomorrow, everything would change, but this time, he wasn't afraid. Thanks for listening to the story. If you've been through something similar, share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to watch the story, a poor janitor saved a dying millionaire. But when he woke up in the hospital, click on right. If you want to watch the story, how the judge fainted when she saw the necklace the prisoner was wearing, the same one her daughter, click on left.